In this lesson, we're going to get familiar with lighting in Unreal Engine 4. Alright, so now that we have learned about basic materials, let's go ahead and talk about the basics of lighting. First thing that we need to know is where we can get the lights to bring them into our scene. Now by default, with this default level, we have a directional light, but we're going to learn how to bring one of those in on our own. So to do this, we'll go over to our Place tab in the Modes panel. You'll want to go to the Lights category, and then from here we can see that we have several different types of lights to use. We have a directional light, which is going to simulate sunlight, so it's coming from an infinite point out in space. We have a point light, which is more of like a light bulb. It's going to emit light from a single point in all directions, so it's a spherical shape. Then we have a spotlight, which is going to emit light from a single point, but it's going to emit it in a cone shape, much like a spotlight, of course. And then we have skylight. Skylight works a little bit differently. What it's going to do is it's going to sample colors from a specific point out in space, or a specific distance, and it's going to apply that color out to our objects in our scene. So let's go ahead and drag in a point light, as this is going to be one of the most commonly used lights that you'll be using in Unreal Engine 4. So let's go ahead and left click and drag this into the scene. You'll notice that it snaps just like any other object. So it collides with those, and then we can just place it in the scene. Now once you've dropped that, there's another way of bringing in lights, and you can do that by right clicking on a surface, and you can say Place Actor, and then you could choose from your Lights category. Let me go ahead and right click up here and let's see if we can get that a little bit better on screen. So here you can see that, and then we can go down to point light. And again, I know that's off screen. You could also use your recently placed, and that will place that light right where you clicked. So let's go ahead and select that one and hit delete on the keyboard to remove that. Now that we have our new light selected, just by left clicking on that, we can move that light. We could even rotate these lights, but seeing how it's a point light, there's not really much point in doing that. Now the one light that you would want to rotate would be your spotlight, or even your directional light. The directional light, you'll notice it doesn't matter where it's actually positioned, it only matters about its rotation. So let's go ahead and hit E on the keyboard, and notice that if you rotate this light, it's basically changing where the sun is located in our scene. Now you'll notice that whenever I rotate this, it changes the overall sky color, and that's because it's just locked together with that dome, and that's done through blueprints, but that's beyond the scope of this course. So with our point light selected, you'll notice that with it we have our details and we have our transform information. Obviously this is going to control our location, rotation, and scale. You can scale your lights, but that's not actually going to adjust the scale of the physical object. It's actually going to adjust the attenuation radius. So the attenuation radius can be found with this blue circle that's going around the outside of the edge. What attenuation does is it limits what the light can affect. And so if we draw that attenuation radius down, you'll notice that that gets smaller, and you'll notice that the light no longer affects this entire area. It no longer affects anything outside of that. And you'll notice that we get a little bit of a decay. So it's going to be 100% from the light source, and then it gradually fades out to the edge here. Perfect. Let's go ahead and set this to 500. That's a pretty good value for us here. Now with the light itself, let's go back up to our transform. We also have this mobility. Mobility is going to be really important for us. Whenever you're working with lights, most of the time you're going to want static lights. Static lights are very, very cheap, but what happens is whenever we build our lighting in our game, what's going to happen is it's going to pre-calculate that light and bake it into the texture of the environment. This allows us to have lighting information in our games, but it's very, very inexpensive, and that boosts the performance of our game. Now we have stationary lights. Stationary lights will allow us to have more of a dynamic effect. So it will cast shadows on dynamic objects in our scene, but we will not be able to move this light, so it has to stay stationary. Now we also have movable lights, which are completely dynamic. And what that means is we can have our character running past the light and it's going to cast a shadow on our environment. However, this will not be pre-calculated, so that's going to mean that it's very expensive, especially if we start using lots and lots of movable lights. So most of the time we'll want to stay with static, but there may be certain cases where we could get away with using a stationary or even a movable light. Now beyond the mobility, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the properties that we have here. We have our intensity. The intensity is obviously going to bump up or decrease the brightness of our light. We also have light color, and we can change that just by clicking on that, and it'll bring up our color picker. And let's choose something that's a little bit more of an orange color. Usually white is not a good value to stick with unless it's something like sunlight, but even then I like to have a little bit of color along with that, just to give it a more believable approach. Okay, so let's go with something like this off yellow or off orange color. Okay, and hit OK on that. So there we go. So that's how you can adjust your lights. Now you'll see that it's blowing out the rest of our geometry in here. It's almost as if there's some sort of light source right in here. Maybe it's something like a fire. We could put it closer to the ground. We could even place something like a particle system on top of that to make that appear like that. We would probably even change the color to be a little bit more orange if it was something like a campfire. But again, you can play around with those values and you can get the exact look that you want. Those are going to be the basics of our lights. I want to bring in one more light here because this is really, really cool. If we go ahead and bring in our skylight, okay, we drag that into the scene, notice that immediately we get a little bit more of a blue tint on our level. Let me go ahead and select that and hit delete, and you'll notice the color change. Notice how that has gone away. Let's bring that back in, and it becomes a little bit more blue. This gives us more of a believable and natural look for outside environments. Alright, so now we can also bring in our spotlight just to kind of show you how this works. You can move it into position, but most of all you'll want to be able to rotate it. Remember, you can switch it over to its local axis, and that might make it a little bit easier to understand which way it's pointing. You'll also want to notice the arrow that's coming out of the icon. That lets us know which way it's pointing as well. Now with the spotlight, we have the same types of parameters. We can make it a static, stationary, or movable light. Most of the time, lights like this are probably going to be stationary because we want to be able to turn them on or off. They could be things like lamps or light sources in a building. Okay. Now we have the same types of parameters here. The only thing that you'll notice that's different from the point light is that we have this inner cone angle and outer cone angle. So the inner cone angle is set to 0, and what that means is that our light will immediately begin to fade out to the edge of our cone. But if we go ahead and set an inner cone angle, you'll notice that our light is strongest within that cone. Let's go ahead and bump up the intensity on that light so we can see it a little bit easier. Okay, so you can see how that's working there. Now if I were to come in and bump up the inner cone angle and get it closer to that outer edge, you'll notice that on the light, it gets this very, very sharp edge. So if I take this up to 44 and make that even, notice how really sharp that gets. Let's bump that down to 10. You'll notice that it fades off, giving us a nice little fall off there. Alright, so now that we've talked about the basics of lighting, let's go ahead and move on into our next lesson where we're going to talk about the basics of blueprints and how they can help us. So we'll get started with that next.